Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Library. Tonight, we are traveling back through time to one of humanity's greatest adventures, a journey that took us from the surface of our home planet to another world hanging in the heavens above. This is the story of the Apollo program, the missions that carried 12 human beings to walk upon the moon and brought them safely home again. It is a story of courage and ingenuity, of problems solved and risks taken, of silent journeys through the void and triumphant returns to Earth's blue waters. For those who watched from below, it was inspiration made visible, a collective dream transformed into footprints on lunar dust. Tonight, we will explore each mission, each crew, each step of the way. From the earliest test flights to the final voyage home from the Taurus-Litoral Valley, you will hear about the machines they built, massive rockets and delicate spacecraft, and about the people who flew them, test pilots and scientists willing to ride pillars of fire into the unknown. Along the way, we will visit the places they explored, craters and mountains and ancient lava plains, landscapes untouched by wind or water, preserved exactly as they were billions of years ago. If these quiet explorations help you find rest at the end of your day, consider sharing this journey with others who might enjoy it. But for now, settle in. Let your thoughts slow. Let the weight of the day lift away. And let us begin this voyage to the moon. The dream of reaching the moon was not born in the 1960s. For thousands of years, humans looked up at that pale circle in the night sky and wondered what it would be like to travel there. Ancient myths placed gods and spirits upon its surface. Early telescopes revealed mountains and plains, suggesting it might be a place, not just a light. By the dawn of the space age, the moon had become more than a dream. It had become a destination. The journey truly began on May 25, 1961, when President John F. Kennedy stood before the United States Congress and issued a challenge that would define a generation. He called for landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was an audacious goal. At that moment, American astronauts had spent barely 15 minutes in space. The technology needed to reach the moon did not yet exist. The rockets were still being designed. The spacecraft were concepts on paper. Even the basic methods for getting there and back were still being debated. But the challenge was accepted, and so began one of the largest peacetime mobilizations of resources and talent in human history. Across the United States, hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, technicians, and workers dedicated themselves to making the impossible possible. Universities developed new materials. Factories built components never before imagined. Launch facilities rose from coastal marshlands, and slowly, piece by piece, the hardware of the Apollo program began to take shape. The Saturn V rocket was the key to everything. Without it, there would be no journey to the moon. It needed to be powerful enough to lift not just the astronauts, but all the equipment they would need for the voyage, including a spacecraft to carry them there, another to land on the surface, and enough fuel to bring them home. The rocket that emerged from years of development was a monument to engineering ambition. Standing 111 meters tall, the Saturn V towered higher than a 36-story building. It was taller than the Statue of Liberty. At its base, it measured 10 meters across, a cylinder of aluminium and steel filled with fuel tanks, engines, and intricate plumbing. Fully loaded with propellant, it weighed 2.8 million kilograms, roughly the mass of 400 elephants. The numbers alone do not capture its presence. Those who stood near it on the launch pad described feeling dwarfed, humbled by its scale. The rocket was built in 3 main stages, each designed to fire in sequence and then fall away when its fuel was spent. This staging system allowed the rocket to shed weight as it climbed, becoming lighter and faster with each phase of the ascent. The first stage, called the SIC, was the largest and most powerful. It contained 5 F1 engines, each a marvel of engineering. These engines burned refined kerosene and liquid oxygen, consuming 15 tons of fuel every second. Together, they generated 34.5 million newtons of thrust at ignition, more power than 85 Hoover dams, producing electricity at once. When the F1 engines lit, the ground shook for miles around. Windows rattled in buildings far from the launch site. Spectators felt the vibrations in their chests as sound waves rolled across the landscape. The rocket did not leap from the pad. It rose slowly, majestically, held down by its own immense weight, even as millions of pounds of thrust pushed upward. For the first few seconds, it seemed to hang there, balanced between earth and sky, fire pouring from its base. Then momentum built, and the great machine began to climb, faster and faster, trailing a column of flame and smoke into the Florida sky. The first stage burned for 2.5 minutes, lifting the rocket to an altitude of 66 kilometers and accelerating it to nearly 10,000 kilometers per hour. Then, with its fuel exhausted, explosive bolts fired. The spent stage separated and tumbled back toward the Atlantic Ocean, where it would crash and sink, its work complete. The second stage, the S2, ignited moments later. This stage carried 5 J2 engines, smaller than the F1s, but more advanced. They burned liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, fuels that produced tremendous energy for their weight. The second stage pushed the rocket higher and faster, reaching an altitude of 185 kilometers and a speed of nearly 25,000 kilometers per hour. After 6 minutes of continuous burn, it too separated and fell away, leaving only the third stage attached to the Apollo spacecraft. The third stage, called the SIVB, had a single J2 engine that could be restarted, a critical feature for missions to the Moon. After its first burn, the stage and spacecraft coasted in a parking orbit around Earth, giving the crew time to check their systems and prepare for the next phase. This orbital pause lasted 2.5 hours, long enough for the spacecraft to complete 1.5 revolutions around the planet. Then, when everything was ready, the third stage engine fired again. This second burn, lasting 5 minutes and 20 seconds, accelerated the spacecraft to over 39,000 kilometers per hour, fast enough to break free from Earth's gravity and begin the journey to the Moon. Once the spacecraft was on its way, the third stage was no longer needed. The crew performed a carefully choreographed maneuver, separating the command and service module from the stage, turning around and docking with the lunar module, which had been stored inside a protective adapter during launch. With the lunar module now attached to the front of the command module, the astronauts were ready for the 3-day coast to the Moon. The spent third stage, meanwhile, was sent on a trajectory that either carried it into orbit around the Sun or, on later missions, sent it crashing into the Moon to generate seismic signals for scientific instruments left on the surface. The Apollo spacecraft itself consisted of 2 main parts. The command module was a cone-shaped capsule, just under 4 meters tall and nearly 4 meters across at its base. This was the astronauts' home, their life support system, and their re-entry vehicle. Inside, 3 crew members sat shoulder to shoulder in custom-fitted couches, surrounded by switches, dials, gauges, and display screens. Every system needed for survival was packed into that small space. Oxygen tanks, water supplies, batteries, navigation equipment, communication radios, and a heat shield designed to protect them during the fiery descent through Earth's atmosphere. Despite its cramped interior, the command module was a masterpiece of design. Engineers had to balance strength and weight, protection and functionality. The outer shell was made of stainless steel honeycomb panels, covered with layers of heat-resistant material. The heat shield on the blunt end was the thickest, designed to withstand temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius during re-entry. Inside, the walls were lined with equipment panels, storage lockers, and control systems. There was barely room to move, but there was enough room to live. Attached to the base of the command module was the service module, a cylindrical section that carried the main engine, fuel cells for electrical power, oxygen and hydrogen tanks, and maneuvering thrusters. Service module's engine was critical. It provided the thrust needed to slow down and enter lunar orbit, to leave lunar orbit and return to Earth, and to make course corrections during the journey. The engine burned hypergolic propellants, chemicals that ignite on contact with each other, eliminating the need for an ignition system. This made the engine reliable, a vital quality when lives depended on it working perfectly in the vacuum of space. The lunar module was unlike any flying machine built before or since. It did not need to be streamlined because it would only operate in the vacuum of space and on the airless moon. Function dictated its form, and so it emerged as an angular, spindly-looking craft, all struts and foil-wrapped surfaces. It had 2 stages. The descent stage served as a landing platform, equipped with a powerful engine, landing gear with wide footpads, and storage bays for scientific equipment and supplies. The ascent stage was the crew compartment, a small pressurized cabin with 2 triangular windows, a hatch, and a smaller engine, designed to lift the astronauts back into orbit when their work on the surface was done. The lunar module was designed for 2 astronauts. They would stand rather than sit during landing and liftoff, held in place by restraints, their hands on the controls, their eyes on the instruments and windows. It was a minimalist machine, stripped of anything unnecessary to save weight. The walls were so thin in places that a screwdriver could punch through them. There were no seats, no comforts. It was built for a single purpose, to deliver 2 people to the surface of the moon and bring them back alive. Before astronauts could attempt a landing, the technology and procedures had to be tested, step by careful step. The early Apollo missions were not about glory or headlines. They were about learning, about building confidence in the hardware and the people. Each mission had specific objectives, carefully chosen to reduce risk and increase knowledge. Apollo 1 was meant to be the program's first crewed flight, a test of the command module in Earth orbit. But tragedy struck before the mission could launch. On January 27, 1967, during a routine pre-flight test on the launch pad, a fire broke out inside the command module. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen, and in that environment, the smallest spark could ignite almost anything. The fire spread in seconds. Flames consumed wiring, equipment, and the astronauts' spacesuits. The hatch, designed to open inward, couldn't be released because of the increasing pressure inside the cabin. Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee sadly could not survive the incident, which unfolded within minutes. The loss was devastating. The program halted. Every system, every procedure, every assumption was re-examined. Changes were made. The pure oxygen atmosphere at launch was replaced with a mixed gas system. The inward opening hatch was redesigned to open outward quickly. Flammable materials were removed or replaced. Fire suppression systems were improved. It took months to implement these changes, but when Apollo flights resumed, the spacecraft was safer. Apollo 4, launched in November 1967, was the first test of the complete Saturn V rocket. There was no crew aboard, only instruments to measure the rocket's performance. The flight was a success. The massive booster worked as designed, lifting a fully loaded Apollo spacecraft into orbit and then sending it on a trajectory that simulated a return from the Moon. The heat shield was tested at re-entry speeds, and it held. Engineers gained confidence. The next steps could proceed. Apollo 5 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit, also without a crew. The ungainly craft separated from its launch vehicle, fired its descent engine, then jettisoned the descent stage and fired the ascent engine. Everything worked. Apollo 6, the second uncrewed test of the Saturn V, encountered problems. Some engines shut down early. Vibrations were more severe than expected. But engineers analyzed the data, made adjustments, and pressed forward. Apollo 7, launched in October 1968, was the program's first crewed mission after the fire. Astronauts Walter Schirra, Don Isley, and Walter Cunningham spent 11 days in Earth orbit, testing the redesigned command and service module. They checked every system, ran every procedure, broadcast the first live television from an American spacecraft, and proved that astronauts could live and work in the command module for the length of a lunar mission. It was not a glamorous flight, but it was essential. Apollo 8 changed everything. Originally planned as another Earth orbit test, the mission was reimagined when delays in the lunar module's development created an opening in the schedule. Instead of waiting, NASA decided to send astronauts to the Moon, to orbit it, and to return, all without a lunar module. It was a bold decision. No humans had ever traveled so far from Earth. No one had ever circled another world. On December 21, 1968, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders climbed aboard their command module atop a Saturn V rocket and launched into history. The third stage engine fired as planned, sending them on a trajectory toward the Moon. For 3 days, they coasted through space, watching Earth shrink behind them and the Moon grow larger ahead. They were farther from home than anyone had ever been. As they approached the Moon, the astronauts fired their service module engine to slow down and enter lunar orbit. The burn had to be precise. Too much thrust, and they would crash. Too little, and they would fly past the Moon and be lost in space. The engine fired on the far side of the Moon, out of contact with mission control. For long minutes, everyone on the ground waited in silence, hoping the burn had worked. Then, as the spacecraft emerged from behind the Moon, communication was restored. They were in orbit. They had become the first humans to see the far side of the Moon with their own eyes. For 20 hours, Apollo 8 circled the Moon, completing 10 orbits. The astronauts photographed the surface, describing vast craters, rugged highlands, and dark maria, the ancient lava plains that early astronomers mistook for seas. They also photographed Earth, a small blue and white sphere rising above the Moon's barren horizon. That image, later called Earthrise, became one of the most iconic photographs in history, a reminder of how fragile and beautiful our home planet is when seen from afar. On Christmas Eve, as people around the world watched and listened, the crew of Apollo 8 took turns reading from the Book of Genesis, sharing words of creation and light as they flew around a lifeless, shadowed world. It was a moment of reflection and wonder. When the time came to leave, the service module engine fired again, accelerating the spacecraft out of lunar orbit and back toward Earth. The return journey was uneventful, and 3 days later, the command module splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. Apollo 8 had proven that humans could travel to the moon and return. The path to landing was now clear. Apollo 9, launched in March 1969, remained in Earth orbit but tested the lunar module with a crew for the first time. James McDivitt and Russell Schweickart flew the spindly craft away from the command module piloted by David Scott, testing its engines, systems, and controls. They practiced the maneuvers that would be essential during a lunar landing, separated the ascent stage from the descent stage, and flew back to dock with the command module. It was a dress rehearsal for the real thing, and it went smoothly. Apollo 10, launched in May 1969, carried Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan to the moon for the final test before landing. Stafford and Cernan took the lunar module down to within 15 kilometers of the surface, skimming over the Sea of Tranquility, where Apollo 11 would soon land. They tested the descent radar, evaluated the visibility through the windows, and practiced the procedures for aborting the landing if something went wrong. Then they fired the ascent engine, climbed back to orbit, and docked with the command module. Everything worked as planned. The next crew would land. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, watched by an estimated 1 million people gathered along the beaches and causeways near the Kennedy Space Center. Millions more watched on television. The crew of Neil Armstrong, Edwin, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins rode the Saturn V into orbit, then began the journey to the moon. For 3 days, the spacecraft coasted across the void, the astronauts monitoring systems, making small course corrections, and preparing for the most critical phase of the mission. On the 4th day, as they swung behind the moon, the service module engine fired, placing Apollo 11 into lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the lunar module named Eagle, while Collins remained in the command module Columbia. They checked their systems, closed the hatch, and undocked. Collins backed away and watched as the Eagle began its descent. Armstrong and Aldrin stood side by side in the tiny cabin, their eyes moving between the instruments and the windows. The descent engine fired, slowing the lunar module as it dropped toward the surface. Everything proceeded normally until the final minutes, when the onboard computer began guiding them toward a landing site covered with large boulders and a crater too dangerous to touch down in. Armstrong took manual control, flying the lunar module forward, searching for a smoother spot. Fuel was running low. Mission Control called out the remaining seconds. 30 seconds. 20 seconds. 10. Then Armstrong's calm voice crackled through the radio. "The Eagle has landed." It was July 20th, 1969. Humans had reached the moon. The 2 astronauts took a moment to celebrate, then began preparing for their moonwalk. 6.5 hours later, Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder attached to the landing leg. At the bottom, he paused on the footpad, then stepped onto the surface. The fine grey dust compressed slightly under his boot, leaving a crisp imprint. As he set foot on the moon, Armstrong spoke the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." 19 minutes later, Aldrin joined him. Together, they explored the area around the Eagle, moving carefully in the moon's low gravity, which is 1/6 that of Earth. They described what they saw: a greyish surface covered with fine dust and scattered rocks, a black sky above, and the Earth hanging like a blue marble in the darkness. The sun cast hard shadows with no atmosphere to soften them. There was no sound except their breathing and the hum of life support systems inside their suits. The astronauts planted an American flag, stiffened with wire so it would appear to wave in the airless environment. They set up scientific experiments, including a seismometer to detect moonquakes and a reflector array that would allow scientists on Earth to measure the precise distance to the moon by bouncing laser beams off it. They collected samples of lunar rock and soil, scooping material into bags and placing it in containers to be brought home. They took photographs, hundreds of them, documenting the landscape and their activities. After 2.5 hours, they climbed back into the lunar module and sealed the hatch. They rested briefly, then fired the ascent engine. The upper half of the Eagle lifted off from the descent stage, which remained on the surface as a monument to the achievement. The ascent took just over 3.5 hours, during which the lunar module climbed back into orbit and rendezvoused with the Columbia, where Collins waited. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back to the command module, bringing the lunar samples with them. They sealed the hatches, jettisoned the lunar module, and prepared for the journey home. The service module engine fired one more time, sending them out of lunar orbit and onto a trajectory toward Earth. 3 days later, the command module separated from the service module and plunged into Earth's atmosphere. The heat shield glowed red, then white, as friction slowed the spacecraft from thousands of kilometers per hour to a speed where parachutes could deploy. The command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th, and the crew was recovered by the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. They had traveled over 1.5 million kilometers, walked on another world, and returned safely home. The success of Apollo 11 opened the door for more missions, each one more ambitious than the last. Apollo 12 launched in November 1969, just 4 months later. The crew of Charles Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean aimed for a precise landing site in the Ocean of Storms, near where an uncrewed spacecraft called Surveyor 3 had landed 2.5 years earlier. The mission demonstrated that astronauts could land exactly where planned, not just somewhere in a broad area. Conrad and Bean spent more than 7 hours on the surface during 2 moonwalks. They explored a landscape of small craters and gentle slopes, collected samples, and set up a more advanced package of scientific instruments powered by a nuclear generator. They also walked to the Surveyor 3 lander, examined it, and removed some components to bring back to Earth, where scientists could study how materials had weathered in the lunar environment. The samples and observations from Apollo 12 expanded scientists' understanding of the Moon's geology and confirmed that different regions had different compositions. Apollo 13, launched in April 1970, was meant to be the 3rd lunar landing. The crew of James Lovell, John Swigert, and Fred Hayes were on their way to the Moon when, 55 hours into the mission, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. The blast damaged other systems, venting oxygen into space and crippling the command module's power and life support. The mission changed instantly from a landing to a survival challenge. Mission Control and the crew worked together to develop a plan. The astronauts moved into the lunar module, which still had its own power, oxygen, and water supplies. They shut down almost everything in the command module to preserve its batteries for re-entry. The lunar module, designed to support 2 people for 2 days on the surface, now had to support 3 people for 4 days in space. It was not designed for this, but it kept them alive. The spacecraft was already on a trajectory that would loop around the Moon and return to Earth, but the timing was wrong. They would miss Earth and be lost in space. Using the lunar module's descent engine, the crew performed a burn to adjust their course, aiming for a splashdown in the Pacific. Then they endured the long coast home, cold and exhausted, conserving power, rationing water, and breathing air thick with carbon dioxide until the crew rigged a makeshift adapter to connect the command module's carbon dioxide scrubbers to the lunar module's life support system. As they approached Earth, the astronauts transferred back to the command module, powered up its systems, jettisoned the service module and lunar module, and braced for re-entry. The command module splashed down safely on April 17th. It was not the mission they had planned, but it became one of the most famous examples of ingenuity, courage, and teamwork under pressure. No one landed on the moon, but everyone came home. Apollo 14, launched in January 1971, returned the program to its original purpose. The crew of Alan Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, and Stuart Roosa traveled to Fra Mauro, a region of hills and ejecta from ancient impacts. Shepard, the first American in space nearly a decade earlier, became the oldest person to walk on the moon. He and Mitchell spent more than 9 hours on the surface during 2 moonwalks, hiking up to the rim of a crater and collecting samples of ancient rocks ejected from deep beneath the surface. They also set up another package of experiments and tested a 2-wheeled cart for carrying equipment, a precursor to more advanced tools on later missions. Before leaving the moon, Shepard famously pulled out a golf club he had smuggled aboard and hit 2 golf balls, sending them flying in long, slow arcs across the grey landscape. It was a light-hearted moment in a serious mission, a reminder that even in the face of great challenges, humans bring a sense of play and wonder. Apollo 15, launched in July 1971, marked a new phase of exploration. The mission was classified as a J-type flight, meaning it carried more equipment, stayed longer, and conducted more extensive science. The crew of David Scott, James Irwin, and Alfred Worden traveled to Hadley Rill, a long, deep channel carved by ancient lava flows. Scott and Irwin also brought a new tool that would transform lunar exploration: the Lunar Roving Vehicle, an electric-powered car designed to operate in the moon's harsh environment. The rover was folded and stored on the descent stage during launch and landing. Once on the surface, Scott pulled lanyards to release it, and the rover unfolded like a mechanical insect. With its wire mesh wheels, lightweight frame, and battery-powered motors, it could carry 2 astronauts and their equipment several kilometers from the landing site, far beyond the walking range of earlier missions. Scott and Irwin spent 3 days on the surface, conducting 3 moonwalks that totaled more than 18 hours. They drove the rover 27 kilometers, visiting geological features that would have been unreachable on foot. At the edge of Hadley Rill, they stood on the rim and looked down into the steep-sided channel, seeing layered rock formations exposed in the walls, evidence of multiple lava flows over millions of years. They collected samples of ancient crustal rock, including a piece of anorthosite, later nicknamed the Genesis Rock, because it was believed to have formed during the moon's early history. They deployed more experiments, took hundreds of photographs, and provided detailed descriptions that allowed scientists on Earth to understand the landscape in ways that remote observation never could. Apollo 16, launched in April 1972, sent John Young, Charles Duke, and Thomas Mattingly to the Descartes Highlands, a region of bright, rolling hills unlike the dark volcanic plains of earlier landing sites. Young and Duke spent 3 days on the surface, driving the rover more than 26 kilometers. They collected samples that surprised scientists, expecting volcanic rock, but finding instead breccias, rocks formed by impacts that shattered and refused material from the moon's crust. This discovery reshaped theories about the moon's geological history and confirmed that impacts had played a major role in shaping the surface. The astronauts also set up a suite of experiments, including one that measured the Moon's magnetic field, and another that studied cosmic rays reaching the surface. They left a camera on the rover that transmitted images of the lunar module's ascent stage lifting off, the first time such footage was captured. It showed the bright flame of the engine and the descent stage left behind, a metallic platform surrounded by footprints and tire tracks, monuments to human presence on an otherwise lifeless world. Apollo 17, the final lunar mission, launched in December 1972. The crew of Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans traveled to the Taurus-Littrow Valley, a region surrounded by mountains and covered with dark volcanic material. Schmitt, a geologist, was the only professional scientist to walk on the Moon, and his expertise made the mission particularly productive. Cernan and Schmitt spent more than 22 hours on the surface during 3 moonwalks, driving the rover over 35 kilometers. They explored a landscape of sculptured hills, ancient rock slides, and deposits of orange soil that Schmitt recognized as volcanic glass, evidence of explosive eruptions billions of years ago. The discovery was exciting because it provided a direct link to the Moon's volcanic past. They collected nearly 111 kilograms of samples, more than any other mission, including rocks from the valley floor, the surrounding mountains, and boulders that had rolled down slopes. Before leaving the Moon, Cernan spoke about the significance of the moment, expressing hope that future generations would return. Then he climbed the ladder, entered the lunar module, and sealed the hatch. As the ascent engine fired and the upper stage lifted off, a camera on the rover captured the event, showing the stage rising into the black sky, disappearing in seconds. The descent stage remained behind, its footpads resting in the dust, the flag and experiments nearby, everything preserved in the airless silence. The astronauts rendezvoused with the command module, transferred their samples, and jettisoned the lunar module. Then they fired the service module engine one last time and headed home. 3 days later, the command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, ending the Apollo program's lunar exploration. Between Apollo 11 and Apollo 17, 12 astronauts had walked on the Moon, spending a total of 80 hours outside their spacecraft, driving over 90 kilometers and bringing back 382 kilograms of lunar material. These samples transformed our understanding of the Moon. Before Apollo, scientists debated whether the Moon was captured by Earth's gravity or formed alongside the planet, or even whether it was created during a catastrophic collision. The rocks brought back provided answers. Chemical analysis revealed that the Moon's composition is similar to Earth's mantle, supporting the theory that the Moon formed when a Mars-sized object struck the early Earth, ejecting material that coalesced into a satellite. Isotope studies showed that lunar rocks are ancient, some over 4 billion years old, preserving a record of the early solar system that has been erased on Earth by geological activity. The samples also revealed that the dark maria are indeed volcanic, formed by lava flows that filled giant impact basins billions of years ago. The bright highlands are older, made of lighter-colored rock, rich in plagioclase feldspar, a mineral that floated to the surface when the Moon's crust was still molten. Impact craters are ubiquitous, evidence that the Moon has been bombarded by meteoroids throughout its history. Without an atmosphere or liquid water to erode them, these craters remain as they were when they formed, a permanent record of cosmic collisions. The experiments left on the surface continued to send data long after the astronauts returned. Seismometers detected moonquakes, small tremors caused by tidal forces, thermal stresses, and occasional meteoroid impacts. Laser reflectors allowed scientists to measure the distance between Earth and the Moon to within millimeters, revealing that the Moon is slowly moving away from Earth at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year. Other instruments measured the solar wind, the thin stream of particles flowing from the Sun, and studied how the lunar surface responds to this radiation. The technology developed for Apollo had impacts far beyond the moon landings. Miniaturized electronics, advanced computer systems, new materials, and improved manufacturing techniques all emerged from the program. These innovations found applications in medicine, communications, transportation, and countless other fields. The program also inspired a generation of scientists, engineers, and explorers, showing that with vision, effort, and cooperation, humanity could achieve goals that once seemed impossible. But the human dimension of Apollo was equally important. The astronauts who flew to the Moon were test pilots, engineers, and scientists. Individuals selected for their skills, judgment, and ability to perform under pressure. They trained for years, studying orbital mechanics, geology, spacecraft systems, and emergency procedures. They practiced in simulators until every switch, every procedure, every contingency was second nature. They flew to the Moon knowing the risks, understanding that equipment could fail, that tiny errors could cascade into disaster. Yet they went. Behind them stood thousands of people who built the rockets, designed the spacecraft, planned the missions, and monitored every second of every flight from mission control. Engineers calculated trajectories, tested systems, and solved problems as they arose. Technicians assembled components, checked wiring, and ensured quality. Flight controllers guided spacecraft through complex maneuvers, talked crews through procedures, and made split-second decisions when things went wrong. It was a collaborative effort on a scale rarely seen, a shared commitment to a single goal. The missions were not without close calls. During Apollo 12's launch, the rocket was struck by lightning twice, temporarily knocking out electrical systems until the crew reset circuit breakers and restored power. During Apollo 14, a faulty switch threatened to trigger an abort during the lunar module's descent, until engineers devised a workaround that bypassed the problem. During Apollo 15, a parachute failed during re-entry, but the other two parachutes were enough to slow the command module for a safe splashdown. Apollo 16 experienced a problem with the service module engine steering system, delaying the landing until controllers determined it was safe to proceed. These and other challenges were met and overcome, testament to the preparation and resilience of everyone involved. Apollo 17's return marked the end of an era. No one has walked on the Moon since December 1972. 3 additional lunar missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, were planned but cancelled due to budget cuts and shifting priorities. The Saturn V rockets that would have launched them were retired or repurposed. Some of the spacecraft built for the cancelled missions were used for other programs. One Saturn V launched Skylab, America's first space station, into orbit in 1973. Another was used for the Apollo-Soyuz test project, a joint mission with the Soviet Union in 1975 that symbolized a thaw in Cold War tensions. The lunar samples remain a resource for scientists. They are stored in carefully controlled conditions at NASA's Johnson Space Center, divided into thousands of individually catalogued pieces. Over the decades, portions have been loaned to researchers around the world, subjected to increasingly sophisticated analysis as new technologies become available. Even now, more than 50 years after the last Apollo mission, scientists continue to make discoveries from these rocks, learning about the Moon's formation, evolution, and history. The Apollo program's legacy extends beyond science and technology. The images of Earth seen from the Moon changed how people thought about the planet. The view of that small, fragile sphere hanging in the darkness, with no borders visible, no divisions marked, inspired a greater awareness of Earth's vulnerability and the need to protect it. The environmental movement of the 1970s drew strength from those images, from the perspective they offered of a planet that is home to all humanity, shared and precious. The Moon itself became more than a distant object in the sky. It became a place, a landscape with features that people could name and remember. The Sea of Tranquility, where Apollo 11 landed. The Ocean of Storms, where Apollo 12 touched down. Hadley Rill, the Descartes Highlands, the Taurus Littrow Valley. These names carry the history of exploration, marking the places where humans once walked and worked, far from home. The astronauts who went to the Moon carried with them the hopes and dreams of millions. They also carried emblems and mementos, symbols of shared humanity. On Apollo 11, Armstrong and Aldrin left a plaque on the descent stage that reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the Moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It was signed by the 3 astronauts and President Richard Nixon. Other missions left similar markers, flags, patches, and items honoring those who had contributed to the program, or who were lost during the journey of exploration. The descent stages of the 6 lunar modules remain on the Moon, along with the rovers, the flags, the scientific equipment, and countless footprints. In the airless environment, these artifacts are preserved almost exactly as they were left. There is no wind to disturb the dust, no rain to wash away the tracks. They are monuments to what humans accomplished, frozen in time on a world that knows no seasons, no weather, no change beyond the slow impacts of meteoroids and the patient accumulation of dust from space. The astronauts themselves returned changed. Many spoke of the profound impact of seeing Earth from the Moon, of realizing how small and isolated the planet is, how dependent we all are on the thin shell of air and water that makes life possible. Described a sense of awe, of perspective, of responsibility. Some devoted their lives to science, education, or public service, seeking to share what they had learned. Others retreated from the public eye, carrying their experiences privately, shaped by memories that few others could fully understand. In the years since Apollo, no other nation has sent humans to the Moon. The Soviet Union, which had competed fiercely with the United States during the space race, eventually abandoned its lunar program. Uncrewed missions continued, with robotic probes from several countries landing on the surface, collecting samples and conducting experiments. But the human presence has been absent. The Moon, once a destination for adventurers and explorers, became again a distant light in the night sky, beautiful and remote, visited in memory but not in person. Yet the dream of returning persists. New plans are being made, new technologies developed. Future missions may establish bases on the Moon, use its resources, and turn it into a stepping stone for journeys deeper into the solar system. The knowledge gained during Apollo, the lessons learned about living and working in space, will inform these efforts. The footprints left in the dust will not be forgotten. They are reminders that humans once reached beyond their world, traveled 250,000 miles through the void, and stood on another sphere beneath an alien sky, looking back at home. Living in space required adjustments to nearly every aspect of daily existence. The simplest activities on Earth became complex challenges in the weightless environment of the Apollo spacecraft. Eating, sleeping, bathing, even using the bathroom demanded new techniques and special equipment. The astronauts adapted, finding ways to maintain routines that provided structure and comfort during their journeys through the void. Food for Apollo missions was specially prepared to withstand the rigors of spaceflight. Most meals were freeze-dried, preserved through a process that removed all moisture while keeping nutrients and flavor intact. Before packaging, the food was quick frozen and placed in a vacuum chamber where the ice turned directly into vapor without becoming liquid. The result was food that weighed very little, occupied minimal space, required no refrigeration, and could last almost indefinitely. Each astronaut received 3 meals per day, providing approximately 2,800 calories. The meals came in plastic pouches, color-coded for each crew member, organized by day and meal. To prepare food, an astronaut used a water dispenser built into the spacecraft, a device that looked like a small pistol with a needle on the end. The needle pierced the food pouch, and pressing the trigger, injected measured amounts of hot or cold water, depending on what the meal required. After adding water, the astronaut kneaded the pouch to mix the contents, waited for the food to rehydrate, then cut open the pouch and ate directly from it using a small spoon. Some foods did not require rehydration. Brownies and cereal cubes could be eaten dry. Thermostabilized meals, similar to military rations, came in sealed containers and could be eaten with a spoon after heating. During Apollo 8, on Christmas Eve 1968, the crew opened their meal packages to find turkey with gravy and cranberry sauce, a surprise that brought a taste of home to their voyage around the moon. On later missions, astronauts could include personal food preferences, and some even smuggled aboard treats not on the official menu. Alan Shepard famously brought golf balls to hit on the moon, and John Young brought a corned beef sandwich on an earlier Gemini mission, earning a mild reprimand for the unauthorized snack. The pouches were equipped with small Velcro tabs so they could be attached to the spacecraft walls, preventing them from floating away during meals. In weightlessness, any object not secured would drift through the cabin. Crumbs were particularly troublesome because they could float into equipment or be inhaled. For this reason, foods that produced crumbs were avoided whenever possible. Beverages came in similar pouches and were consumed through straws or squeezed directly into the mouth. Sleeping in space presented its own challenges. In weightlessness, there is no up or down, no mattress to lie on, no pillow to rest your head against gravity. The Apollo command module had sleep stations, essentially hammocks or bags attached to the walls where astronauts could zip themselves in to avoid floating around the cabin during rest periods. Some astronauts preferred to sleep in their seats, held in place by straps. Others found comfortable positions floating in open spaces, arms extending outward in what became known as the zombie position, a natural posture the body assumes in zero gravity. Sleep schedules on Apollo missions were carefully planned. Mission Control tried to maintain a regular rhythm to help the crew rest properly. But the excitement of the journey, the constant hum of equipment, and the shifting of sleep periods to accommodate mission activities often made restful sleep difficult. Some astronauts reported sleeping poorly during their flights. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, after landing on the moon, were supposed to rest for 4 hours before their moonwalk, but opted to skip the rest period because they were too excited and too focused on the tasks ahead. The temperature inside the spacecraft could vary significantly. The command module had systems to regulate heat, but depending on the spacecraft's orientation relative to the sun, one side might be exposed to intense solar radiation, while the other side faced the cold of space. Astronauts sometimes woke feeling chilled, other times too warm. After landing on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin spent their rest period inside the lunar module, which had no seats, only a small floor space. Aldrin lay on the floor, while Armstrong rigged a hammock using straps and equipment, suspending himself above the ascent engine cover. The cabin temperature dropped to 16 degrees Celsius during the night, and both men slept in their spacesuits for warmth. They rested fitfully, awakened periodically by the sounds of pumps, fans, and their own thoughts about the tasks that lay ahead. Personal hygiene in space was minimal. There were no showers, no running water, no bathrooms as we understand them on Earth. Astronauts cleaned themselves with moist towelettes, wiping their skin and trying to maintain some sense of cleanliness despite the cramped conditions and inability to truly bathe. Shaving was possible, using safety razors and shaving cream, though the process had to be done carefully to prevent hair clippings from floating through the cabin. Some astronauts chose to grow beards during longer missions rather than deal with the inconvenience. Using the toilet in space was one of the more uncomfortable parts of early spaceflight. The first spacecraft didn't have proper facilities, only simple collection systems that astronauts had to rely on. It wasn't the most dignified setup, but it worked and was essential for the mission. For liquid waste, astronauts used a basic tube connected to the onboard system. During moonwalks, their spacesuits included built-in solutions to manage this, allowing them to stay outside longer. Later missions even added drinking water features inside the suits, so astronauts could stay hydrated during extended activities on the lunar surface. The spacesuits themselves were marvels of engineering. The suits worn on the lunar surface were called extravehicular mobility units, and they were far more than simple garments. Each suit was a miniature spacecraft, a self-contained environment that protected the astronaut from the vacuum of space, extreme temperatures, micrometeorites, and radiation. The suits consisted of multiple layers. The innermost layer was a cooling garment laced with thin plastic tubes through which cold water circulated, carrying away body heat. Over that came layers of insulation, pressure bladders to maintain internal air pressure, and an outer shell of tough, tear-resistant fabric coated with reflective material to deflect solar radiation. The helmet was a clear bubble that provided a wide field of vision while protecting the astronaut's head. Inside the helmet, a cap held communication equipment and microphones. The visor could be lowered to shield the eyes from the brilliant sunlight that on the Moon is unfiltered by atmosphere. On the astronaut's back sat the portable life support system, a backpack containing oxygen tanks, a carbon dioxide scrubber, a water cooling system, batteries, and radio equipment. The entire assembly weighed about 82 kilograms on Earth, but only 14 kilograms in the Moon's lower gravity. Putting on the suit was a lengthy process that required assistance. First came the cooling garment, then the pressure suit, then the helmet and gloves, which locked into place with metal rings. The backpack was attached last. Once sealed inside, the astronaut relied entirely on the suit's systems for survival. A breach, a malfunction, or running out of consumables could be fatal. The suits were tested extensively on Earth, but the lunar environment presented challenges no simulation could fully replicate. Dust, in particular, proved troublesome. The fine, abrasive lunar soil clung to everything, working its way into seals, hinges, and fabric. After moonwalks, astronauts spent considerable time brushing off as much dust as possible before re-entering the lunar module. But they could never remove it all. The dust smelled strange, described by some as resembling gunpowder, by others as burnt or metallic. It was a smell unlike anything on Earth because it was the result of material that had never been exposed to oxygen or moisture. Once inside the lunar module, with helmets removed, the astronauts could smell it on their suits, in the air, on every surface. The dust irritated their eyes and noses, and later missions took precautions to minimize exposure. Despite its nuisance, the dust was also a reminder that they were walking on a world utterly unlike home. The astronauts who flew Apollo missions were not ordinary people, though they would insist they were simply doing their jobs. They were test pilots, engineers, military officers, individuals selected for their skills, their ability to remain calm under pressure, and their capacity to make quick decisions. Many had flown combat missions. All had logged thousands of hours in high-performance aircraft. They understood risk. They had seen friends lost during training and unexpected incidents. When they climbed aboard a rocket, they did so with open eyes, aware that spaceflight was dangerous, that systems could fail, that despite every precaution, they might not come home. Training for Apollo missions took years. Astronauts studied orbital mechanics, celestial navigation, spacecraft systems, geology, photography, and physical fitness. They practiced in simulators that replicated the command module and lunar module cockpits, running through every phase of flight hundreds of times until procedures became automatic. The simulators were connected to computers that could introduce failures, malfunctions, and emergencies, forcing the crews to diagnose problems and implement solutions under time pressure. Flight directors and instructors watched from control rooms, evaluating performance, offering guidance, and ensuring the astronauts were prepared for anything that might happen. Geological training was particularly important for lunar missions. The astronauts needed to recognize different types of rocks, understand how impact craters formed, and describe what they saw in terms that scientists on Earth could interpret. They attended lectures by geologists, studied maps of the Moon, and participated in field trips to locations on Earth that resembled lunar terrain. They visited meteor craters in Arizona, volcanic fields in Hawaii, and desert regions in the southwestern United States. During these exercises, they wore their spacesuits, collected samples, and practiced describing features while communicating through radios, simulating the experience of working on the Moon. They also trained in water tanks, where neutral buoyancy simulated the weightless environment of space. Wearing spacesuits weighted to float at a constant depth, astronauts practiced moving in 3 dimensions, maneuvering bulky equipment, and performing tasks that required dexterity despite thick gloves. These underwater sessions helped them develop techniques for working efficiently in conditions where every movement had to be deliberate and controlled. Physical conditioning was essential. Astronauts followed rigorous fitness programs to ensure they could withstand the stresses of launch, adapt to weightlessness, and perform strenuous work on the lunar surface. They ran, swam, lifted weights, and maintained diets designed to keep them healthy and strong. Medical staff monitored their condition closely, conducting regular examinations and watching for any signs of illness or injury that might disqualify them from flight. The astronauts also spent time with their families, though the demands of training often kept them away from home. Wives and children learned to live with the uncertainties of spaceflight, the long absences, the public attention, and the knowledge that their husband or father was preparing for a journey from which he might not return. Some families handled the pressure well, others struggled. The astronauts themselves rarely spoke publicly about the emotional toll, maintaining a professional demeanor and focusing on their work. But privately, many acknowledged the strain, the worry, the awareness that every mission carried risks that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. When launch day arrived, the astronauts woke early, underwent final medical checks, ate breakfast, and suited up. Technicians helped them into their spacesuits, sealed the helmets, and connected the life support systems. Then they rode in a van to the launch pad, where the Saturn V rocket waited, bathed in floodlights if it was a night launch, standing stark against the sky if it was day. They took an elevator to the top of the gantry, walked across a swing arm to the spacecraft, and climbed through the hatch into the command module. Once inside, they settled into their couches, strapped in, and began working through pre-launch checklists, while technicians closed the hatch and backed away. For the next few hours, the astronauts communicated with mission control, verifying systems, monitoring the countdown, and waiting. The rocket beneath them held millions of kilograms of fuel, volatile chemicals separated by thin metal walls. Any malfunction could trigger an explosion, and the astronauts knew it. Launch escape systems were in place to pull the command module clear if something went catastrophically wrong during the early seconds of flight. But those systems had never been tested with a crew aboard. The astronauts placed their trust in the engineering, in the thousands of people who had built and checked every component, and in their own training. As the countdown approached 0, the astronauts felt the rumble of the engines igniting, a deep vibration that built until the entire vehicle shook. Hold-down clamps released, and the rocket began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The acceleration pressed them into their seats, building to nearly 4 times the force of normal gravity. They could barely move their arms. Breathing required effort. Instruments blurred slightly under the vibration. Then, after 2.5 minutes, the first stage engines cut off. The sudden silence was startling, broken only by the continued hum of systems and the voice of mission control in their headsets. Explosive bolts fired, the first stage separated, and moments later, the second stage engines ignited, pushing them higher and faster. This cycle repeated through each stage until, just over 11 minutes after launch, they were in orbit, traveling at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour, circling Earth every 90 minutes. The transition to weightlessness was immediate and disorienting. Objects secured moments before now floated. The horizon curved visibly through the windows, and below, the Earth spread out in blues, browns, whites, and greens, a living world seen from a perspective few humans had ever known. While the astronauts flew in space, another team worked on the ground, monitoring every aspect of the mission from a room in Houston, Texas. Mission control was the heart of Apollo, a place where flight controllers sat at rows of consoles, watching data streams from the spacecraft, calculating trajectories, solving problems, and making decisions that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The room was designed as a 4-tiered auditorium, with controllers sitting at different levels, each console dedicated to a specific spacecraft system or mission function. At the front of the room, large screens displayed maps, trajectory plots, and critical data. Above, a glassed-in viewing gallery allowed visitors to watch the proceedings, though during critical mission phases, access was restricted to essential personnel. Each console in mission control was staffed by a specialist, an engineer or scientist responsible for monitoring one part of the mission. The flight director sat at the center, overseeing everything, making final decisions, and coordinating the team. The flight director's word was law during a mission. If a flight director said to abort, the mission aborted. If he said to proceed, the mission proceeded. It was a position of immense responsibility, and the men who held it, including Christopher Kraft, Eugene Kranz, Glyn Lunny, and others, were among the most experienced and capable individuals in the space program. The capsule communicator, known as Capcom, was always an astronaut, someone who understood what the crew was experiencing and could communicate clearly and efficiently. The Capcom was the only person who spoke directly to the crew during normal operations, filtering information from the other controllers and passing along instructions, questions, or updates. This single voice reduced confusion, and ensured that the astronauts received clear, coordinated guidance. Other controllers monitored specific systems. The ECOM watched the spacecraft's electrical and environmental systems, tracking power levels, oxygen supply, and cabin temperature. The FIDO, or Flight Dynamics Officer, calculated the spacecraft's trajectory, planned course corrections, and ensured they stayed on the proper path to the Moon and back. The GUIDO, or Guidance Officer, monitored the spacecraft's navigation systems and computer. The surgeon tracked the crew's medical condition, watching vital signs transmitted from sensors in their suits. The TELMU and control officers monitored the lunar module during descent and ascent. Each role was critical, and together, the controllers formed a team capable of responding to almost any situation. Behind Mission Control's main room lay a network of support spaces, back rooms staffed by dozens of additional engineers and specialists. Each console in the main room had a corresponding back room where experts analyzed detailed data, ran simulations, and provided information to the front room controllers. If a problem arose, the backroom teams worked to understand it, develop solutions, and brief the controllers on the best course of action. During Apollo 13, when an oxygen tank exploded and crippled the spacecraft, these backrooms became hives of activity as engineers scrambled to find ways to bring the crew home alive, using systems and procedures never intended for such circumstances. The mission control team worked in shifts, with 3 teams rotating through 8-hour periods, so someone was always watching the spacecraft. Controllers could go home between shifts, but during critical mission phases, many stayed at their consoles for extended periods, sleeping in nearby rooms, grabbing meals from vending machines or food delivered to the building, and returning to work as soon as possible. The intensity was extraordinary. Mistakes could cost lives. Delays could jeopardize the mission. And yet, the controllers remained calm, professional, and focused, trusting in their training and their teammates. When Neil Armstrong announced that the Eagle had landed, controllers in mission control erupted in brief celebration, then immediately refocused on the next phase of the mission. There was still uncertainty about whether the lunar module was stable, whether the surface could support it, whether systems had been damaged during landing. They monitored every reading, every communication, ready to call for an abort and emergency liftoff if anything seemed wrong. Only when Armstrong and Aldrin completed their moonwalk and lifted off safely did the controllers allow themselves to truly relax. And even then, the mission was not over. The astronauts still had to dock with the command module, leave lunar orbit, and survive re-entry. Every phase mattered. During Apollo 13, Mission Control faced its greatest challenge. The explosion that damaged the service module occurred 55 hours into the mission, when the spacecraft was already on its way to the Moon. The crew reported a loud bang, alarms, and systems failing. In Mission Control, controllers watched in horror as telemetry showed oxygen venting into space, power dropping, and the command module becoming uninhabitable. Within minutes, flight directors and their teams began working to save the crew. The solution they devised was unprecedented. The astronauts would move into the lunar module, shut down almost everything in the command module to preserve its batteries for re-entry, and use the lunar module as a lifeboat. But the lunar module was designed to support 2 people for 2 days on the Moon, not 3 people for 4 days in space. Mission control teams calculated how to stretch consumables, how to modify systems, and how to keep the crew alive long enough to reach Earth. One critical problem was carbon dioxide buildup. The lunar module's carbon dioxide scrubbers were being overwhelmed by 3 people breathing in a small space. The command module had spare scrubbers, but they were square, and the lunar module's receptacles were round. Engineers in Houston gathered materials available on the spacecraft, including plastic bags, cardboard, tape, and hoses, then built a makeshift adapter. They radioed instructions to the crew, who assembled the device, later nicknamed the mailbox. It worked, keeping the air breathable. Another challenge was navigating without the command module's main systems. Controllers calculated a trajectory that would loop around the Moon and return to Earth. But it required a precise engine burn, using the lunar module's descent engine, a maneuver the engine was never designed for. They ran simulations, checked the math repeatedly, and guided the crew through the burn. It worked. The spacecraft was on a path home. The journey back was cold, dark, and exhausting. With power reduced to minimal levels, the cabin temperature dropped near freezing. Water was rationed. The crew endured, communicating with mission control, performing necessary tasks, and waiting for the long hours to pass. Finally, as they approached Earth, the astronauts transferred back to the command module, powered up its systems, jettisoned the service module and lunar module, and prepared for re-entry. The heat shield had to be intact. If it had been damaged in the explosion, they would burn up. Controllers held their breath during the re-entry blackout, the minutes when the command module is surrounded by superheated plasma and cannot communicate. Then, right on schedule, Jim Lovell's voice came through the radio. They were alive. Parachutes deployed, and the command module splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. Mission control erupted in cheers, tears, and relief. It was a triumph of ingenuity, teamwork, and determination. The Apollo program required more than astronauts and flight controllers. It demanded the efforts of hundreds of thousands of people across the United States. Engineers designed components, technicians assembled hardware, scientists developed experiments, manufacturers produced materials. Every piece of the spacecraft, every system, every procedure was the result of countless hours of work by individuals who understood they were contributing to something larger than themselves. At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, launch crews prepared the Saturn V rockets and Apollo spacecraft for flight. They stacked the stages, installed equipment, tested systems, and conducted final checks. The work was meticulous, requiring attention to detail and adherence to strict quality standards. A single mistake, a loose bolt, or a mislabeled wire could lead to disaster. The technicians understood this, and they took pride in their work, knowing that astronauts' lives depended on doing everything correctly. At factories and research centers around the country, contractors and subcontractors produced the components that made Apollo possible. North American Aviation built the command and service modules. Grumman Aircraft built the lunar modules. Boeing built the first stage of the Saturn V. IBM built the spacecraft computers. Thousands of smaller companies provided everything from valves to wiring to fabric for spacesuits. The coordination required to bring all these parts together, ensure they worked properly, and deliver them on schedule was a management achievement as significant as the technical accomplishments. The scientists who designed experiments for the lunar surface worked with astronauts to ensure the equipment could be deployed and operated properly. They wanted to learn as much as possible from each mission, to gather data that would advance understanding of the Moon and the broader solar system. The experiments left on the Moon continued transmitting data for years, providing information about moonquakes, solar wind, and the precise distance between Earth and Moon. The samples brought back were divided and distributed to laboratories around the world, where researchers subjected them to ever more sophisticated analysis. The Apollo program also inspired a generation. Young people watching the missions on television decided to pursue careers in science, engineering, and exploration. Universities saw increased enrollment in technical programs. Industries related to aerospace grew. The sense that great things were possible, that challenges could be overcome through dedication and ingenuity, permeated society. The images from the moon, particularly the view of Earth rising above the lunar horizon, changed how people thought about the planet, fostering awareness of its fragility and beauty. But the program was not without controversy. Some questioned the cost, arguing that the billions spent on Apollo could have addressed poverty, education, or other social issues. Others noted that the space race was driven as much by Cold War competition with the Soviet Union as by pure scientific curiosity. Civil rights leaders pointed out the irony of celebrating exploration while systemic inequalities persisted at home. These criticisms were valid, and they reflected the complexities of the era. Apollo was an achievement born of a particular moment in history, shaped by political, technological, and cultural forces that converged to make the moon missions possible. The astronauts themselves often reflected on their experiences with a mix of pride and humility. They had walked on another world, seen Earth from a distance, and participated in an endeavor that would be remembered for generations. Yet they also recognized that they were representatives of a much larger effort, that their names were attached to the missions, but thousands of others had made the journeys possible. Many astronauts devoted their post-NASA careers to education, public service, and advocacy for continued exploration. They wrote books, gave lectures, and shared their stories, hoping to inspire others to pursue ambitious goals. Some astronauts found it difficult to adjust to life after Apollo. They had reached the pinnacle of their careers, achieved something extraordinary, and then had to figure out what came next. A few struggled with the transition, facing personal challenges or searching for new purposes. Others found fulfillment in different fields, applying the skills and lessons they had learned to new endeavors. All carried memories that few others could understand. Moments of standing on the moon, of seeing Earth from space, of feeling the power of a rocket lifting them beyond the atmosphere. The moon itself remains unchanged by the brief human presence. The footprints left by 12 astronauts are still there, preserved in the fine dust, undisturbed by wind or water. The flags they planted have likely been bleached white by unfiltered sunlight, their fabric deteriorated but still standing, silent markers of where humans once stood. The descent stages of the lunar modules sit where they were left, platforms of metal and foil surrounded by the tracks of boots and rover wheels. Monuments to exploration, frozen in time on a world that knows no change. In the decades since Apollo 17, no humans have returned to the moon. Priorities shifted, budgets were cut, and attention turned to other programs. Space stations, robotic probes, and missions to other planets have continued the work of exploration. But the moon has remained a destination visited only by uncrewed spacecraft. Yet the desire to return persists. New plans are being developed, new technologies created, and new generations of explorers prepared. The knowledge gained during Apollo, the experience of living and working on another world, will inform these future missions. The legacy of Apollo extends beyond the specific missions. It demonstrated what humans can accomplish when they commit to a goal, when they pool their knowledge and resources, when they accept risks in pursuit of discovery. It showed that the boundary between Earth and space is not a barrier but a threshold, one that can be crossed with the right tools and determination. It provided a perspective on our planet that changed how we see ourselves, reminding us that Earth is a small, fragile sphere in the vastness of space, a home we share and must protect. The rocks brought back from the moon sit in vaults, still yielding secrets decades after they were collected. The experiments left on the surface transmitted data until their power sources failed. But the information they provided continues to be analyzed. The photographs taken by astronauts, images of lunar landscapes and Earthrises, and footprints in dust, remain powerful reminders of what was achieved. And the stories told by those who flew, by those who worked in mission control, by those who built the hardware and planned the missions, are part of our collective memory, passed down to inspire and inform. Humanity's relationship with the moon has always been one of wonder and curiosity. For thousands of years, it was a mystery, a light in the night sky that waxed and waned, marking the passage of time, inspiring myths and dreams. Then, for a brief period in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it became a destination. 12 people walked on its surface, looked up at Earth, and realized how far they had come, how small we all are, how vast the universe is. They returned with more than rocks and data. They returned with a changed perspective, a sense of accomplishment, and a message about what is possible when we reach beyond ourselves. The voyages of Apollo were not just journeys to another world. They were journeys into our own potential, explorations of courage, ingenuity, and the human spirit. They showed that when we dare greatly, when we work together, when we refuse to accept limits, we can achieve things that once seemed impossible. The moon still hangs in our sky, silver and serene, a reminder that we once went there, that we once stood on that distant shore and looked back at home. And perhaps, someday, we will return, not just to visit, but to stay, to build, to learn, to continue the journey that Apollo began. Until then, the footprints remain, quiet testimony to the moment when humans first stepped beyond their world and touched another. The missions are over. The astronauts have returned. The rockets have been retired. But the spirit of Apollo endures, a belief that exploration matters, that pushing boundaries is part of what makes us human, that the universe is vast and full of wonders waiting to be discovered. It whispers in the night when we look up at the moon and remember that people once walked there. It echoes in the words Neil Armstrong spoke as he stepped onto the lunar surface, words that captured not just a moment, but a truth. One small step, taken by a single person, can represent something far greater, a leap forward for all of us, a movement toward the future, a reaching for the stars. The story of Apollo is a story of adventure and discovery, of risk and reward, of individuals and teams working toward a shared goal. It is a story of what we can accomplish when we try. And it is a reminder that the greatest journeys are not just about reaching a destination, but about the courage it takes to begin, the determination required to continue, and the wisdom to appreciate what we learn along the way. The universe is still out there, vast and waiting. The moon remains, a stepping stone to further exploration, a place where humans proved they could survive and work beyond Earth. And somewhere in the future, perhaps not so distant, others will follow the paths blazed by Apollo, traveling to the moon, to Mars, to destinations we can only imagine now. They will carry with them the lessons learned during those missions, the knowledge gained, the inspiration provided by those who went before. You have traveled with us tonight through the story of the Apollo Voyages, from the first tentative steps into space to the final footprints on the moon. You have heard about the rockets and spacecraft, the astronauts and controllers, the challenges overcome and the triumphs achieved. You have seen how humans, driven by curiosity and determination, reached beyond their world and touched another. As you rest now, let those images settle gently in your mind. The great Saturn V rising on a pillar of fire. The Earth hanging in the blackness of space, blue and beautiful and fragile. The lunar surface, grey and ancient and untouched by time. The astronauts moving slowly in low gravity, gathering rocks, planting flags, looking up at the home they left behind. The voices from mission control, calm and steady, guiding them through every step. The splashdown, the recovery, the return to Earth's embrace. These are more than historical events. They are reminders of human potential, of what becomes possible when we work together, when we commit to great goals, when we dare to dream and then do the work to make those dreams real. The voyages of Apollo changed our world, not by bringing back treasure, but by giving us perspective, by showing us our place in the cosmos, by proving that exploration is not just about discovering new lands, but about discovering ourselves. The moon is still there, waiting in the night sky. The footprints are still there, preserved in airless silence. And the story of those who went continues to echo, inspiring new generations to look up, to wonder, to dream of their own journeys to distant worlds. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts quiet. Let the weight of the day fall away. You have traveled far tonight, across time and space, to witness one of humanity's greatest adventures. And now, as you rest, know that you carry that story with you, a reminder that we are all part of something larger, all connected by our shared home, all capable of achieving more than we sometimes believe possible. The stars shine above, the moon glows softly in the darkness, and somewhere, in the silence of space, the footprints wait, testaments to the moment when humans reached beyond their world and touched infinity. Sleep well, dream of other skies, other worlds, other journeys yet to come. You have done enough for today. Close your eyes, rest, and let the gentle darkness carry you to peaceful sleep. Good night.